I'm going to keep this kind of brief because, in fact, we know a lot of people here are familiar with Soul Speak, who've been with me for years, and who may or may not know Joan, but who do know Sylla Liscombe, who was my partner in Soul Speak, who is now going into the movement business in terms of dancing and things like that. She's extending what we did at Soul Speak, and I'm continuing myself in terms of stuff on the web, primarily, although once in a while a book will pop out, like this one, which I'm going to talk about. Let me say that I sent this book out to test readers, I guess when it was about 3/4 finished, just to see what kind of reaction I'd get. Some people I'd known for a very long time, and some people I had just met, some people, they were all supposedly readers. They still read books. And 2 or 3 of the people would never talk to me again. It was an unbelievable reaction. And I won't say why, but it's usually for religious reasons or scholastic reasons or whatever. And then there was somewhere in the middle, people said, oh, okay. And then to some people, wow, this is okay, you know. So I went back and I started to rework the book. The problem was that the book is about a period, 2000, 2007, where I had a series of psychic experiences, which you're not supposed to have. Or if you have them, you're crazy, whatever it happens to be. But what I did is I kept notes as to what was happening, and certain people were involved. One was Joan was involved. Some of the other psychics aren't here because one is Diane Randall, who has MS. She contracted MS afterwards and just can't make it up the stairs anymore. And what I spent is a period of 7 years trying to figure out what those messages meant. It never happened to me before. It hasn't happened since, just during that period of time. During that period of time also, what had happened is that a thing we had founded as Sarasota Poetry Theater. Joan was there initially, and then she went off to work with a rock band. Well, we started to give performances in cafes. And some people may remember it, I don't know. But we had mimes, and we had singers, and we had dancers, and we had actors, and we were trying to make poetry come more alive. And it was highly successful. People loved it, but I didn't love it. Because there's something about it, I didn't like reading my poems from a page. I wanted it to be more what happened to me when a poem came to me. And I should explain that my poems, I'm the poet, I get the poem, comes to me somewhere, I'll be walking down the street, or I'll be sitting on my porch, or whatever it is, or I'll look up and the poem just starts to pour out of me. So I don't plan anything. The poem comes to me in the original way that it came to poets. I don't work the poem to death afterwards. I pretty much, it comes, I write it down, and then we kind of put it out to the world. What I want people to experience is what I experienced when the poem came to me, which is a time, what happens in a poem, a true poem, is that it comes to you unbidden. It's a true psychic experience. You don't ask for it. You can't sit down and write a poem. If you do, it's not a poem. It's just poetic thinking, and it's nice, but it doesn't bring you to a new state of consciousness. What a poem does, it enters you from somewhere. We don't care where it is. It's X. Okay, the muse speaks, and the poem comes up, and it closes itself, and you end up in a moment of consciousness that's not your normal consciousness. It's like it's a moment of orgasm where you're one with everything. Something happens. I think what happens is that a poem is a natural way for your unconscious mind to marry your conscious mind for just a few brief seconds or minutes, and you become totally human. Not just a thinky bitch, but not just a screaming person who's screaming from the unconscious, but you bring it all together at once. And you become totally human, divine, godlike. Whatever it happens, that's what all artists experience, to work from that level of intuition up. And all the work you do afterwards, adding rhymes to it, and all this, it's just like, it's like extra busy work. I don't need it anymore. It's a skill, it has a certain beauty to the poem, maybe or maybe not. But I've decided long ago that I would take the poem as it's delivered, because it's the best chance of the poem really, when you read it, you experience what I did experience. What happened eventually is that I just didn't, something was missing, and I thought, well, maybe if we could speak the poem as it comes to us, just like they did before we learned to read and write, then people could feel what we're feeling, because it's brand new to us, and we're not actors. So if you want to really feel what a poem feels like when it comes to me, you have to be in front of me when the poem comes. And I change. You'll hear it in my voice, you'll hear it in the rhythm, you'll hear it in everything. Unfortunately, there are no books on how to do this. That old pre-literate poetry, which existed for tens of thousands of years until we learned to read and write, and which existed for thousands of years afterwards until the printing press. They kind of coexisted side by side with the scribes. There are no books on it. There are books on some of its technical aspects, but no books that this is how you do it. And we didn't know how to do it. So what we did is we tried and tried and tried and tried, and it was like a Frankenstein. We were half in the writing head and half trying to speak spontaneously. Speaking poems like in Soul Speak, for those who have done it, and there's some here who have done it, is somewhere between writing a poem as we know today and speaking in tongues. Meaning that when you speak in tongues, you're completely in the unconscious control of the unconscious mind. That's it, you know, nobody knows what's happening, but somehow people understand each other. Of course, writing is, as it comes to you, try to get as much down as you can, and then you try to reconstruct it later. But what we found is that if we simply surrender to the idea of a poem, the feeling idea, not the mental idea, the feeling idea of a poem, which is an act of praise that rises unbidden from the unconscious and brings us to a new moment. If we just surrender to that and had the balls to do it, because it's very scary, since you don't know what the unconscious or the muse has on her mind at that stage of the game, that a poem would arise. And we tried it, and it didn't work until finally we met a musician by the name of George DeJohn, who was going to make it today, but something happened, who was the third key. Because this poetry that we were attempting to do, not knowing what we were trying to do, by the way, we were just trying to feel our way in the dark. What had happened is somehow, in our desire to do it, what came up from the unconscious eventually was the first form of poetry, which is an antiphonal poet is a speaker, and as a responder, and it's done to music. And if you want to see a picture of that's done, you just play any Tarzan movie, or any kind of movie like that of the Indians. You see them going around in a circle, which is a divine form, and somebody says, "Nuda-ba-ta-ba-ba," and the rest of the crowd goes, "Nuda-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba." Goes on for hours. What they're really doing is they're doing a praise act. They're speaking to the gods. And the first poems were prayers. First prayers were poems. They came unbidden from the unconscious, and they were praises of the unknowable, the gods, as you see fit. So what happened is that when George joined us, we were just sitting in the studio one day, and we'd been trying to do it. It hadn't been successful. We have the early recordings of them. Is that we just started to speak, and he started to play without any preconception of what we were going to do. And this poem came out, which we eventually called Dark Journey, which absolutely flipped us out. When we finished it, I looked at my partner and George, and I said, "God damn, what happened?" It just formed itself perfectly, with no conscious intervention. Poem opened, we were speaking, and I'll give you an example of what this sounds like, what Soul Speak sounds like, and it closed itself perfectly. We were all brought to that moment of when the unconscious rises up and we become totally whole or divine or totally human. And it's a moment, it's a slight orgasm. If you don't get a slight orgasm when you write a poem or read a poem, you're not reading a very good poem and you're not writing a very good poem. But it's a little orgasm because it's a moment of creation in which the two parts of you come together. So that is why poets do it a lot, because they know if they get that moment, then the poem is correct. And you can read thousands of poems today that are all coming out of our universities that have no orgasm at the end. Just nice writing. Because they're trying to write from here rather than from the depths of their being. And let that control the act. So anyway, that I thought I'd play for you something that Joan and I did. Give you some example of what I'm talking about, okay? So people, oh, is it rap? But what is it? I mean, you dance around like the natives in Africa? I said, no, we don't do that. We just let the poem come up through us. Now we have some people who have worked with us. Pat Musselwhite Weaver back then, we worked with her therapeutically with women who were in their 40s or 50s or 30s who were all multiple personalities, who had been abused by their parents in so many ways you can't count, who couldn't look at people. But we brought Soul Speak in, and in fact allowed them to speak together about what they were feeling. And I see no difference between the work that we did artistically, Joan and I, and Sylla and I, and George, and people. Eric joined us too at some stages to play the keyboard. Jan did too. And the work we did with people who were in therapy. Because it was the same thing. We just taught them how to let go by example. We didn't teach them anything. We just did poems in front of them until it, and then they started to do it. Perhaps you could say something about that group that we worked with you for about 18 months of those women. That what happened to them from your point of view as a therapist? People don't believe this, by the way. We apply for new grants to do this. They think it's voodoo. Because nobody looks at art today as a hero. It is voodoo.
Tell them it's voodoo. No, these women would come to therapy and they would sit like this. They couldn't say anything to anyone. Some of them would wear the sunglasses or they would turn around. They were so shy and scared that they could barely be in the presence of other people. And we brought in the Soul Speak, and they begin to share their pain in a symbolic way. And it bypassed their inner critic. And people with multiple personalities have so many critics, sometimes they can't even speak. They'll start to say something and they'll just stop because somebody inside stopped them. And so they had no inner critic. They just came and they could contain their rage for those 5 to 7 sentences and speak on a very profound level. And I like to share something personal. After we were done with that, this group of women actually spoke at a state conference on child abuse in the millennium. 4 of them went. We had a 3-hour slot. I told all about what happened to children when they became adult, all the aspects of it, and each of the 4 took one of the aspects and expounded, and the people in the audience were judges, therapists, detectives, child abuse workers, all the most threatening people for these women, and they spoke out loud about their trauma and what it did to them. So they were totally changed. The only difference was the Soul Speak. Wow.
So that shows you the power of this poetry. It had that power on myself personally, on Joan personally, on Sylla personally. We did lots of poems, hundreds and hundreds of poems. They go up in the air and they were never recorded or written down because we worked extensively with all kinds of therapeutic groups. The process was the most important thing. Creating the poem and letting it be created within you out to others was the most important thing. Here's a very funny story that I'll tell you about that. That I had a doctor once who was renting my house. I go to Mexico during the winter because I like it there. And he said, I understand, and he was a little kind of perky guy, he was a surgeon, and he said, just understand that you're a poet. I said, yeah, I'm a poet. He goes, can you do a poem for me? And like I said, well, could I? Oh, sure. You know, so I looked at it for a second, and I did a Soul Speak poem for him, just kind of keying off something about his nose and his hair and things like that. And the poem was a good one, surprisingly. In fact, the muse always rises to the moment, you know? You have an unbeliever, and you have a believer, and you have the muse in back of you. There's no contest, you know? So the poem came out, he was just stunned for a moment. He said, wow. And then he was very unhappy. He said, where's the poem? He wanted something, he wanted stuff. I said, well, it's here in my heart, it's in your heart. Oh, okay. See, so that's the thing that we're fighting is the stuff thing. All of the rational things that we're hanging on to when it's right within us as to where all the glory is, you know. So let me play something for you. Let me explain as to how we do Soul Speak. Sometimes it just happens. We were in such a state of excitation for 4 years. This is some of the work we produced. This is only a part of the recorded work we produced in terms of CDs. We had to build a studio. We didn't know anything about that stuff. We had to build a studio, build multiple 8 inputs, whatever it is, because we had a singer, myself, Sylla, George, John. We had sound effects coming in, and we would bring them in real time. No after processing, and it was done once. That was it. And since we were all working unconsciously, basically it always worked correctly. And in fact, that led us to believe that poetry is a form that's in us. If you don't fuck with it, it will come out correctly. Even if 2 or 3 people speaking and singing at the same time, and we have those recordings as proof of that happening. So that first form, by the way, is the first form that we did as human beings. And that's part of what this book is about, called Alice Hickey, who, while I was producing all of this with Scylla and with Joan, as well as some books, we did books too, you know. We went into movies, we went in, as all this was going on, I was going half crazy trying to figure out what these psychic visitations were all about. So, in that 7-year period, where if you think I'd be in a corner counting spiders, I wasn't. I was working with Pat, working with other people, writing books, doing things, but trying to figure out what was going on was a very difficult task. So there were certain people I turned to. One was Joan, who was very powerful and intuitive, and then I turned to Diane Randall, who couldn't make it today. She's almost, she can't move anymore. She's an MS, she's in a little house. And Jane Washington, who was in the book, also, who was a black singer. So I kind of turned to them, and they brought me to a point of understanding it, and they said, well, we can't go any further. And then Alice Hickey appeared, who was very smart, and who was who I would say was an academic psychic of enormous powers, who then unscrambled the rest of it for me over the period of 6 or 7 years. One of the things that came to me was a very long poem about creation, but I didn't know whether it was the creation of man, the creation of consciousness, or what form of consciousness. I didn't know what it was about. I didn't understand it. Because the way I operate is I let the poem come through me, whether I'm writing it or whether I'm speaking it, and all I know is that it feels true. So either my lips move or my pen moves. As soon as it feels false, I know I've lost it. I've lost that golden thread that's coming up from the unconscious. So trying to figure that out, I had first thought, well, maybe it's about poetry, but it wasn't really. What it turned out to be, finally, after Alice appeared on board, and I had begun to kind of unfigure it myself, by using the work of Julian Jaynes. If you haven't read his work, came out, we were just talking about it. He's a book out called The Origin of Consciousness. Came out in 1960 or so. It's a groundbreaking work. He was a Princeton biologist and a lover of poetry who made the discovery, which a lot of us thought for a long time, is that pre-literate people's consciousness was different than ours. When you read in the Odyssey that the goddess Athena speaks to Ulysses, that's not a figure of speech. That's what pre-literate people hear are voices of the gods. So when it's a recording in the Odyssey and the Iliad, or that's the way their minds operated, and beyond that, they were pretty much in a state of natural meditation. And when they hit a kind of situation where they didn't know what they were doing, they'd hear a voice. Do this, do that, the gods would appear, speak. Hi, come on in.
Sorry,
it's good to see you. Frank and Diana Colson making a dramatic late entrance.
Oh, you're right in the middle of your reading.
Just sit down in the
No,
chair.
it's not the middle. Timing is perfect, but come find a seat and get a drink, because this is kind of do-it-yourself. I have like a spring.
Yeah. Is anybody in the room?
No, and you can have this one too.
Here, here's a chair here. Yeah, I'm just in the middle of some nonsense. Okay.
Carry on.
Okay.
Perfect timing.
Thank you.
Okay.
So anyway, as I was saying, is that I was beginning to think, well, it's a poem about consciousness, and then I discovered that it was a poem about our very first consciousness, because it kind of matched what Julian Jaynes was saying about that first consciousness. It seems that our consciousness changed when we learned to read and write, and we now have our current consciousness, which when we're presented with a novel idea or a situation, we kind of figure it out by just projecting ourselves into the future and going back in the past, looking what happened, and we kind of figure it out rationally. Whereas pre-literate man didn't work that way. When he had a very novel situation, he would hear voices directing him. And he also heard very powerful voices of the muse in terms of the poetry, which I think are much more powerful than the voices that affect me here today. So, with that as a guide, I was pretty sure that it was about pre-literate consciousness. And then when I met Alice Hickey, she said, well, it's also about the Mother Goddess period, because that was the cradle at which poetry was born. And she knew the work of Robert Graves and the White Goddess about the Mother Goddess, and she knew the work of Jung, and she knew the work of Julian Jaynes, and she kind of pieced it together for me that it was a poem about the birth and the death of that first pre-literate consciousness. And in fact, she thought it was also an announcement or a signal that a new consciousness was in the course of coming into being, one that was not totally locked into the physical real world and the rational, but was more balanced and had some of the intuition and the psychic abilities of our earlier consciousness. So anyway, that's what the book is about. It kind of starts out in the Florida supermarket and winds its way back into prehistory, into the period where there were no male gods. There was only the female gods. The mother goddess, the first mother. And Alice had a great deal of knowledge about that anthropologically and psychically and the rest of it. And then it goes back to the very first person, who was a woman, has to be a woman if you look at it that way, and the very first poems that came out, which was what the mother goddess was the first storyteller. So she became a sense. But the Graves thought is back in the 50s and 60s that the early mother goddess was the muse. They were one and the same. And when we dropped all the mother goddess nonsense and went on with Hercules and the rest of the male gods, Jehovah and the rest of them, is that the muse snuck in with disguise. So that the female goddess still is today in the form of the muse. Those who are artistic, who hear those impulses or feel those impulses that guide them in their art, that's what the muse is still here with us today. So let me play a poem for you. And how we do these, either they just come out of us and we're in a recording studio, we kind of know what's going to happen. It's like childbirth. You call up everybody and get them together. Or what happens in the case of September 11th is I was out in Santa Monica with Joan, and we were lying in bed, because it's 3 hours earlier there, whatever it is. And we watched, we had the news on, and we saw that one of the World Trade Towers had been crashed into. And I remember in the 30s where something hit the Empire State Building. I said, God, it happened again like in the 30s. And then the second one hit, and we knew it wasn't. I just tried to say to Joan, I said, dark angels were coming, you know, so it was very powerful. So what happened is that at that trip out to California, I stopped to see a friend in San Antonio who is a painter, and he gave me one of his paintings, one of his watercolors, which you'll see as it came up. And we used that. I took little pictures of little sections of it. It was of boats in a harbor, and we kind of made a little rough storyboard of it. That's how we work sometimes. And then I just played the storyboard with some music from a group in England who are big fans of ours, called Entropique, and we're fans of theirs. They have a cello in their group, so it's very kind of moving. And we hit go, and then we recorded this poem. Just one take, that was it. Oh, so this takes about 4 minutes. If you can't see this, that's okay, because you'll hear it. And I'm just going to start it up a little bit past the beginning. It takes about 4 minutes. But you'll see how it forms and how everything just fits in together in the music. And God knows, okay? And then I went back and I fixed the pictures up a little bit, since we really had them as very rough triggers. We wanted them to trigger our unconscious, and I knew they would, because when I looked at them, I got very uneasy. So I said, this is it.
10 alarms, that would equate to roughly 200 to 225 New York City firefighters who were in the building.
I love to drive along the seacoast. It's my favorite. Could be anywhere. Anywhere there's a seacoast. It's always the same and it's always different. Waves crashing, sky meeting, water, sometimes boats, always clouds, always sun, always moon, and within those a million things can happen and do happen.
Sometimes in my dreams, it's September 11th, all over again. It's night. I'm all alone on the coast, watching the fishermen far out in the water, and thinking, it will never be the same. All I can think about is the first tower exploding, and then the second.